Hello everyone, how's it going? My name is Ellias, and today's video I'll be talking about all the books I've recently read in the month of March. I know I did a recent reads video a couple weeks ago, detailing all the books I've read, in the span of like 2 to 3 months, but I just decided to film a video where I talk about all the books I've read last month just because it's a handful already. And I feel like I wouldn't remember sort of the integral information and just all the feels that I read for these books. So I read a total number of 6 books, which I thought was a huge plus for me in the month of March in general. There are some highlights and there are some definite lows, because if you did not watch my previous recent reads, I read a couple of books that it was just extremely bad. But guess what? I actually went ahead and read the sequel for one of the books I rated 1 star. So that was a time. Anyways, before we get further into the video, I would like to thank today's video sponsor, PBS, in honor of the release of Hemingway, a 3-part 6-hour documentary on the exploration of Hemingway, his life, his work, and his art, and his influence in literature and culture today. This 6-hour documentary series is directed by award-winning filmmakers Ken Burns and Lynn Novik, and this series will air on PBS on April 5th to the 7th. The documentary series will not only go over his famous literary works, but also who he was as a writer and author, his limitations and bias as an author during his time. It'll highlight the highs and also the lows, the rise and the fall of a tragic author who, during his final years, suffered from chronic alcoholism and serious mental illness. The documentary will also focus on his famous literary works such as For Whom the Bell Tolls, The Sun Also Rises, Farewell to Arms, and The Old Man in the Sea, which I've read, as well as his non-fiction work, Death in the Afternoon, and A Movable Feast, which I've also read. So just a little backstory and my personal connection to Hemingway. If you guys didn't know, I was homeschooled throughout my entire life. Well, in high school. During my high school years, I had an English tutor, and she not only tutored me and my brother, but we were assigned to read A Movable Feast, and I remember this being sort of a short story collection about Hemingway and his life in Paris. From what I remember, this takes place during his early years as a writer in 1920s. However, we were only assigned to read certain selected chapters from this book. I believe it has 20 chapters, and we were only assigned to read 10. I would like to reread this book from beginning to end as a whole, because it's really interesting to me how he was living during the time of all these prolific, great literary writers who are still well known and extremely influential to literature today. One of the chapters in this book that really stood out to me was a chapter all about F. Scott Fitzgerald, because I was also reading The Great Gatsby at the same time. It was interesting to see how these two writers connect. Not only Scott Fitzgerald, but also through other notable writers during his time, such as Sylvia Beach, James Joyce, John Passos, and Gertrude Stein. The other book that I read and probably remember most from Ernest Hemingway is The Old Man and the Sea. I remember reading this book and thinking to myself how it almost read like a fairy tale. This is about an old man who lives by the sea and his struggles as a fisherman. So after a long period of time, this character goes out to the sea and eventually stumbles across the biggest fish he has ever seen, a marlin. And the book basically just goes over the details and the struggles of this fisherman trying to capture this large marlin fish and trying to bring this large creature, this fish, back. Both of these books are extremely short, and I'm also very interested in reading Hemingway's other novels. I also might want to collect his other books in these editions as well. So overall, I'm really looking forward to finishing and watching the rest of the documentary. If you guys are interested in watching the documentary and learning all about Hemingway, his work, and his life, this will be available to watch and stream for free on the PBS video app. This will be available on iOS, Android, Roku streaming devices, Android TV, Apple TV, Amazon Fire TV, Samsung Smart TV, and Chromecast. So you have plenty of options. Again, this documentary series will be airing from April 5th to the 7th at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And a huge thank you to PBS for sponsoring today's video. With that being said, let's go ahead and get straight into the books. Alright, first up, A Court of Silver Flames by Sarah J. Maas. Chronologically, this is the 4th book in the A Court of Thorns and Roses series, all about fairies, sex, and sass. This one follows the bitchiest sister of the 3, Nesta. And let me tell you, Nesta, I loved her. She was a literal stone cold bitch. And that was essentially, for the most part, her entire personality, and I was here for it. I was living. Every single time she would snap back, especially at any of the male characters in this book, I was clapping for her, I was rooting for her the entire time. You know, prior before reading this book, in the previous trilogy, Nesta just seemed flat out mean and cruel, as if she didn't really care about any of her sisters or her family aside from herself. And it did seem that way for the first book, but in the second book and in the third book, we sort of get to see the complexity and the layers of her character. And out of the 3 sisters that this whole series revolves around, she's my favorite. I just loved who she was as a person, her character. She was just hands down the best character in the whole series in general. So mild spoilers, as I'll be talking about the events that happened after the trilogy. If you haven't read the series like at all, you can just move on to the next timestamp where I talk about the next book. But essentially, we are following Nesta as she is now Fae after coming out of the cauldron and dealing with PTSD after the traumatic events of the third book and the death of her father. If I had to give props to this book, I really liked the way that Sarah comes up with these new inventive ideas in this world in general. I think the world itself is so interesting, especially everything that has to do with the myths, the lore of this world. I think it's just really interesting at how these creatures and how these stories, these dark ancient ones and gods and monsters all evolve. So we have a new subplot regarding a new dangerous enemy and the mortal queens, who were a huge nuisance in the previous trilogy. Basically, Nesta throughout this whole book goes on this journey of self-acceptance and forgiveness, which for me was actually a really great read. It just wasn't really all about the fantasy, the magic, the fighting, and everything. It was more about character development. This probably has the most character growth, development, and build-up in any of her other characters in this series. I think that's pretty much all the positive things I want to say about this book. Let's talk about the negative stuff, because there are a ton of negatives that I had. Let's see. Let's start off with every single male character in this book. No, specifically, let's talk about Rhysand. I fucking hate Rhysand. Rhysand was such a little bitch in this book. I kid you not. Okay, there are two types of bitches. There's Nesta, and then there's Rhysand. I'll let you figure out which one's the better one. Rhysand just made terrible decisions. Terrible. And they want him to be king in this book. Like, no. He took the term alpha male to a whole new level. Oh, you're gonna say that Rhysand is a feminist? Yeah, white feminist. Yeah, he doesn't really care about anything or anybody else except for his mate. And the things that he said, how he acted just towards also Nesta in general, he was such a shitty character in this book. I just hated it. He was the worst. His character and growth from the original trilogy to this book, man, he's basically on the same list as Tamlin for me. He was just honestly so fake woke. Everything that he said, everything that he does is just like, you're so annoying. Just stop talking. Be gone. Go away. Also, Cassian as Nesta's love interest. I wasn't feeling it. I feel like he was just, how do I say this without being mean? Who gives a fuck? I feel like he was just too dumb to be on the same level and par as Nesta. Nesta is just on this whole other vibe, this whole other level than every character in this book. And she just in the end ends up with Cassian, which is not a spoiler. Of course, it's very obvious. But I was like, between the two, if you had to choose between Cassian and Azrael, I would have liked if Nesta ended up with Azrael in the first place. Because, you know, I sort of get why Cassian ends up with Nesta. You know, he balances her out. And he's sort of like the opposite of her character in general. He's just too jock, too playboy for her character. And I just didn't see it. I just didn't really see the spark, the romance. Speaking of the romance in this book had the most sex scenes I've ever read in Sarah J. Maas's books. It was just sort of too smutty for me, especially reading about two straight people going at it. It was just not a time. I honestly skipped a lot of the sex scenes because it just wasn't for me. And about the representation, let's talk about that for a moment. That's it. Anyways, back to the sex scenes. If you really like dick popping, mouth throbbing, breast swelling, sexy, hot, naked scenes, you might really enjoy this book. I did not, for one, vibe too much with the sex scenes, but that's just me in general because I just don't really care to read about heterosexual romance. But if you're the type of person who really likes, you know, fantasy romance and really sexy scenes, then it is your lucky day because this book has a shit ton of them. In the end, I'm giving this book a 3.5 out of 5 because there are some parts that were really good. Parts that were good, they were very, very good. I really liked last 200 pages of the book and the beginning 100 to 200 pages of the book. Everything in the middle was a lot slower. Like I said, it's a character-based book with heavy hot sex scenes between two fairies. But I know for a fact that I think we're getting Azrael's perspective for the next book. Also, I would not mind if for the next book, Sarah J. Maas decided to make Azrael gay or even single. Like he's not even remotely interested in any female character at all for the next book. And I'm okay with that. All right, the next book we're going to talk about is Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. So after reading A Court of Silver Flames, I was still in the mood for a good fantasy. I was feeling that vibe. So I went along on my bookshelf and this book caught my eye and I was like, well, you have been sitting on there for quite a while, so why not? Let me tell you, this book did not disappoint. It essentially satiated my appetite for fantasy in general, and this book genuinely surprised me in the best way possible. If you're the type of person who really likes fairy tale-esque elements in their books, then look no further because this book will be perfect for you. This one takes the core elements, the core aspects of several different fairy tales. The main prominent one I can think of is the Snow Queen and also Rumpelstiltskin, and just blends them all together in this book. Just overall so slow moving, beautifully written, and just amazing. in every sense. I really love the way that Naomi developed these three characters. We're essentially following these three women and how they're navigating their world in different classes. One of them is the daughter of a duke, one of them is Jewish and she's a moneylender taking after her father, and one of them comes from an abusive household. The story is more about the tribulations and the perseverance of these three characters, these three girls overcoming their struggles and living through these trials and errors. I really liked how the story weaved between fantasy and fairy tale like elements. So the story follows these three main girls trying to save their kingdom and their village, their home, their families, their livelihood from a greater evil, a demon. I had a few main critiques about the story. I would say that the last 10 pages of this book was a little rushed for me. I wish that the romance would have been better developed between sort of the main love interests, because I feel like we get to see all this backstory and then we just immediately skip to the end without exploring the details, the fine lines of it. Also, one of the things that I loved about this was that it's a standalone, so it has a beginning and an end. This also does take place in the same world as her other book, Uprooted, which I also loved. Overall, I really loved it. It was really nostalgic and just very reminiscent of the fairy tales that I read and loved as a child. Also, if you're the type of person who really loves the trope enemies to lovers, this one will give you the bang for your buck, because this one was just, ooh, it was done really well. I really enjoyed it. Overall, giving this a strong 4 out of 5. So after I completed Spinning Silver, I went straight ahead into urban paranormal fantasy. I read Wild Signs by Patricia Briggs. So this book is, I believe, the 6th book in the spin-off series in the Mercy Thompson universe. And this one mainly follows two werewolves, Anna and Charles, as they navigate all these mythologies and curses revolving around a greater evil. So each book in the story can sort of be read as a standalone. However, you pretty much won't get the big picture of their relationships and their families and their inner lives without reading each book chronologically. This one had a really interesting premise, and the setting itself was just chef's kiss. This takes place in the California wilderness, high in the mountains, in the forest, in the woods. And I loved it. It was just overall well done, because I live in California and I've been hiking and camping in these woods, in these mountains, and Patricia captured the essence perfectly. So we follow our main characters as they try to solve and figure out the disappearance of this entire self-established settlement that has gone missing. And they basically try to figure out these disappearances only to figure out there's something much more dangerous and evil lurking in these woods that has awoken from its giant slumber. So prior before going to this, I would actually give a huge trigger warning for rape and sexual violence. So this evil entity in of itself was just essentially using its powers to impregnate women, which is uncomfortable, and the overall abundance of just sexual violence in this book was just really off-putting. So I'll heed that warning if you have read the books and decide to go into this one just knowing that's in there, and that just really lowered my enjoyment and taste for this book in general. I'm giving this book a 3 out of 5 because originally I was really enjoying it. It was probably going to be like a really strong 4.5 rating, and then upon finishing it, I was just like, ooh, boy, I don't know how to feel about this. You can tell a good story with character depth and development and how evil a thing can be without relying on sexual violence and rape. And so overall, giving a 3 out of 5 for the characters and the world building and the premise, but everything else ultimately fell flat for me. So moving on into the next book and staying in the same genre, I read the last book in the series, Brothersong by TJ Klune. So Brothersong is the last book in the series that is essentially all about gay werewolves. What more can you want? It is literally every furry's freaking dream. Essentially, we follow our main characters and this whole world as everything comes to a close and fighting the last main giant evil of this entire series. However, of all the books that I've read so far from TJ Klune, I think in this series, Brothersong was probably the weakest. I didn't really like how the majority of this book, we were just traveling and walking, of just going on through this long journey of the main character trying to find the love of his life. I mean, spoiler alert, but you are already gonna know he's going to find the love of his life no matter what. It's basically inevitable. It's a trope that you know that the main character will succeed in, because I just overall knew he would overcome these trials and obstacles to get to his mate, his other half. Like, everything to me in this book was just so predictable. There wasn't any surprises. There wasn't anything new offered or brought up. And I get that it's the last book, everything is supposed to tie in and close together, but at times it felt so cheesy to me. I was cringing at a lot of the dialogue in this book because everything is revolving around pack and family and love, but so much of that was just heavily emphasized and just heavy-handed in a way where I was like, all right, I get it. I've read this in the past 4 or 5 books. It was just overall extremely repetitive, and I was like, all right, I get it. I think that this book was just overall too long and just too predictable in every sense. I mean, not to say that I didn't like this book. There are some parts that I really loved, seeing all the characters again and how, their relationships with each other. It was just a beautiful thing to read. However, I do want to say that the last 50 pages of this book really brought it home for me. Tying it, saying goodbye to these characters, it was just really bittersweet. Of all the books in the series, the first book is probably my favorite, Wolfsong. If you're into queer representation and just hot werewolves, you know, vibing with each other, having sex, then this series might be for you. So overall, I'm giving Brothersong a strong 3.75 out of 5. All right, the next book is The Power by Naomi Alderman. So this is the March book pick for the Late Night Book Club. I'm not going to say too much because there will be a live show for this book where my co-hosts and I will discuss our thoughts and feelings for this book. All you need to know is that I think there are some really interesting ideas thrown around in this book. A look at authority and power and oppression. I liked it, I'm glad that I read it, and that's all I'm going to say about this book. So we have come to the end of this video where I'll be talking about the last book that I read. So if you all remember my previous recent reads video, I talked about this particular book that I read because of book Twitter and how everyone was just recommending it and how they loved it, and I gave it a go, gave it a try, and I read it. And it was the absolute worst fucking thing I've ever read so far this year. And guess what? Guess what? I don't know why I did this to myself. I gave the first book 1 star, and I went ahead and got the sequel from the library, thinking to myself, cannot be as bad or worse than the first book. Bitch! I was fucking dead ass wrong. This book is bad, if not worse than the first book. I even went on Goodreads, and everyone was like, oh my god, it's immaculate, I loved it, it's 10 times better than the first book. Chill, calm down. There was no way that this book was better than the first book. I would even say that the first book is miles, leagues better than this book. This book was essentially a filler episode. Nothing happens. Absolutely nothing. I was fucking scammed. Scammed. I want a refund. I want the last 2 weeks of my life back. I'm probably being overdramatic again and exaggerating, but you know what? Fuck it. The biggest sin that this book commits, nothing happens in the first 80% of the book. I kid you not, nothing happens. We're just reading the aftermath of the battle of the last book and just traveling to this new location that the main characters are going towards. And that's essentially it. So there will be spoilers. If you haven't read the first book and you plan on reading the first book, shoot, go away. I'll be talking about spoilers from the first book into the second book because there's no way I can go into talking about other things that happened in the second book without spoiling the events of the first book. So, goodbye. Castile, he's still a dick. He has no personality trait aside from being hot and having dimples. He makes literally the worst decisions ever, and he says like the cringiest things. Cringy dialogue is still there. Man, why did I think that giving this book a second chance would just be redeeming in of itself? I was fucking dead wrong. Why do you even do this to myself? Who knows? I make bad decisions, just like Castile. I guess that's a thing that we have in common and we can relate to. There's a huge factor in this book where at the end of the first book, he tells Poppy,
you and I, we're getting married. You don't have a choice.
A big takeaway of having all our problems is we're getting married. This is probably the most realistic thing that I can relate to because, you know what? If a hot, powerful, wealthy, chosen prince comes up to me and says,
Ellias, marry me.
I would have been like,
no. Well,
okay. A simp, I tell you. A simp. So book 1 was essentially on Poppy and how stupid she was. Book 2 just literally confirms how stupid Castile is. These two are a match made in heaven, or hell, depending on how you look at it. There's a point in the book where Poppy always knows when Castile is around. And you know how she knows? It's not through the love bond or whatever that they have for each other, which I will also talk about later, but it's through how he smells. He always smells of rich, lush, dark spice, pine, and citrus. And throughout the entirety of this book, Castile is nowhere near any vicinity of oranges or tangerines. I double checked. There's no way he could smell like citrus 24/7. I kid you not. It's not even a get ready with me where, you know, he sprays cologne in the morning, getting ready, getting dressed. It's more like they're outside in the wilderness when you're like sweating and stinking. He still smells like spice. I don't even know what kind of spice. Pine. But the areas that they're in, they're not pine trees. They're just regular forest trees and also citrus. Where do you get the citrus from? Throughout this entire book, I kid you not. There's so many references, like more than 5 or 6, where Poppy's like, I immediately smell dark spice and pine and citrus. I immediately think of dark spice, pine, and citrus. Oh my god, I'm suffocating in dark spice, pine, and citrus. Dark spice, pine, and citrus, the 3 main elements that make Castile who he is. He never eats an orange, he's never in vicinity of any oranges. Maybe honeydew is the only fruit that he'll ever be tasting or smelling, depending on how you look at it. Also, this is just a generalization, but what is it that every single like romance character, the main love interest, has a big dick? I have never read where the main character, a main love interest, just has an average sized dick. Why do they all need to have 12-inch long dicks? Don't know. Will I ever read a book where the main love interest, the main character says, he has an average sized dick. He's definitely a shower, not a grower. Like, I get it. Every single book, y'all are tops. Let's talk about Poppy for a second, because we can't go talking about this book without talking about our main love, unexpected girl, Poppy. Poppy is such a contradiction to herself. She keeps telling herself she's good at things when she literally says the exact opposite or acts a certain way. Her character trait is only acting cool if she has a weapon in her hands. But without a weapon, she just acts totally different, like a whole new different person. This is part of the book where she has like a bow and arrow, and she's just essentially like,
ooh, me so good with the bow and arrow. Ooh, a sword. Me so good and dangerous and professional with a sword because I was taught by a professional.
ooh, watch me kill monsters. That is essentially the only character trait that Poppy has. Literally. There's one part in the book that just didn't really make sense to me. Poppy and Castile, after a heavy, bloody battle, go into a carriage with a dead body and bone each other. They go at it real hard, real steamy in the carriage with the dead body. I mean, I've read all kinds of sex scenes, okay? But this one just takes the cake because you're really gonna go at it with a dead person while being all bloody, sweaty, smelly, and disgusting right there in a closed space in a carriage. So there's this thing, you know, especially in fairies or when it comes to supernatural creatures, mates, okay? People have soulmates and they call each other mates and everything. But do you know what they call each other mates in this book with Poppy and Castile? They call each other heartmates. Heartmates. What is something super different, just so different, but staying in line of just the soulmates? Ah, I got an idea. Heartmates. That's what it is. When I tell you, when I first read about that, I literally screamed. I cringed so hard. Like, I would have just been fine if you stuck along with soulmate or just mates in general. But really, heartmates? I was like, damn, yes, I really gotta give Jennifer props because heartmates. From now on, from every supernatural book that I read, every time they call each other mates, I'm not gonna accept that. I'm only gonna accept heartmates from now on, even in my own life. Heartmates. Done deal. Alright, what else do I need to say about this book? Like the fact that the last 20 fucking pages of this book, the last 20 to 50 pages of this book, had actual plot. This book was literally more than 600 pages, I kid you not. 600 pages of just going to a different location, traveling, and nothing happening aside from a huge snide remarks, some heated moments, but that's it. I'm obviously having fun here and going at the series harder than I usually do, but it is what it is, and I cannot believe how invested I am in the last 80 pages of this book. It's insane. I'm so invested to the point where I am actually making plans to read the last and final book of this fucking series. You heard that right. I am essentially going to read the last book in this trilogy because it comes out actually at the end of the month of April. I guess you can call it what it is, a blessing in disguise. If I read the third book and I get an inkling of the same structure, story format that I got in the second book, I'm DNFing that shit. There's no way in hell you can make me read through 600 plus pages of just traveling dialogue and just talking only to get through the actual substance and plot of the actual book. So that in of itself is my overall thoughts of what is this book called? Kingdom of Flesh and Blood? Kingdom of Flesh and Fire. So ultimately giving the sequel 1 out of 5 stars. Oh my god, I'm so tired. I'm just talking about all that. Anyways, let me know down in the comments below any of the books you recently read that you loved or hated. I would be interested to know. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you guys all soon with a new video. And out of the three sisters that this whole story, and out of the three sisters that which was actually a really for me was actually I really liked the so at its core a basic summary about this book is that it's about however the journey and also